2 crossings of the Rocky Mountains in the summer of 1937. The first was by 5 girls, 2 boys, and a young doctor in a party of 13 guides and wranglers and 75 horses, cutting trail through unmapped country between the Fraser River in British Columbia and the Peace River block in Alberta. The second was by 3 girls, Nicholas Ignatieff, and 4 guides, traveling upstream in 2 boats from Fort St. John on the Peace River to Prince George in British Columbia, following the route taken by Alexander Mackenzie in 1793 when he became the first European to reach the Pacific overland north of Mexico. Both trips were organized by Nicholas Ignatieff as a surveying and mapping expedition for 32 boys from Upper Canada College, Toronto. And it was his idea that we girls should do the return trips home with the guides, horses or boats and equipment. The boys had started from Wembley, Alberta, with 86 horses to survey around Mount Alexander and emerged 3 weeks later at Bend on the Fraser River. They then collected 4 specially constructed boats at Prince George to take them north down the Pack and Parsnip rivers to Findlay Fort and east down the Peace River to Fort St. John. Our party of girls went out to British Columbia by Canadian National Railway and made camp on the Fraser River while waiting for Nicholas and the boys to come out of the mountains. The film was taken by Elizabeth Me under considerable difficulties and is a far from complete record of a most exciting and interesting trip. On the Packhorse trip, I had the camera and light meter tied to the saddle. In order to film, I had to dismount, tether my horse, untie the equipment, check the light, and set the camera. So often, after all that, what I wanted to shoot had long since passed. Added to these difficulties, the weather was overcast or actually raining almost the whole of the 16 days in the mountains. Not good for filming. So do make allowances. It was the first time I'd ever filmed and the first time I'd been on a horse. These maps will show our route. Map of Canada. The area of our travels. This detailed map has been drawn as we remember the places passed 52 years ago. It will not coincide with modern maps because of the great changes in the landscape in the intervening years since the building of the Alaska highways in World War II and the opening up of the area with roads. We have not been able to find the Jarvis Creek we followed for a whole week on any map, nor even Jarvis Lake on the divide from which it flowed. Modern maps show neither snowshoe nor bend. This is the Fraser River, and here is Snowshoe, a whistle stop between Jasper and Prince George, where the train was stopped to let us off with our 19 pieces of baggage. Bend, where the boys' party came out of the mountains, was 40 miles nearer Prince George. For 3 days, we followed trails cut by the boys through dense forest, crossing the Fraser and McGregor rivers to Jarvis Forks. For 8 days, we followed Jarvis Creek, cutting trail and fording the creek several times a day, eventually reaching Jarvis Lake, 8,000 feet up on the Great Divide. From there on, we were in the foothills of the mountains, where the country was much more open. Crossing the Wapiti, we were back in Wembley after 16 very exhausting days on the trail. Nicholas Ignatieff, the organizer of the expeditions. He was one of a Russian family who had escaped from Russia at the time of the Revolution and was currently a master at Upper Canada College. He had a passion for the wilds of the Canadian West and wanted to share it with young people from Eastern Canada. Members of the party: Janet Hart, Charlotte Horner, Mary Gray, Elizabeth Gray, Elizabeth McElrath from Scotland, we called her Spike, Jimmy Gardner, Jumbo, Jimmy Bailey, Slug. The doctor, Dr. Arthur Doidge, we called him Butch. Bert Osborne, the outfitter of the party from Wembley, Alberta, surrounded by the other 12 guides and wranglers. It was he who collected the 86 horses for Nicholas's party. Adam, the head guide, a full-blooded Indian. Pete Campbell, he had a Scottish grandfather he was very proud of. Dan, a rancher. Gert Dalgleish, another rancher. Ray and Narcissus. Narcissus was another full-blooded Indian. Shots taken at Jasper, where we spent a day en route. I was trying out the camera. Mount Robson, the highest peak in the Rockies. The train stopped to let passengers take photos. Late evening, and goodbye to our train at Snowshoe. On the move to camp on the Fraser while awaiting the arrival of Nicholas and the boys. Snowshoe. All there was at Snowshoe, a general store and a sawmill. The local boatman, Shorty Shivers, brought us across the Fraser in his boat. Everyone was so helpful and kind. Shorty helping us to unload our stuff at the Smith's Ranch. Butch in the boat. Charlotte practices riding while we wait for real horses. Our neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Joyce, who had been panning gold all their lives in Alaska, Siberia, California, and now on the Fraser, show us how it's done. Tiny specks of gold. Hail and farewell to the boys at Bend over a meal of bear meat stew. They went home to Prince George to their boats, and we set out with the horses on the return trip to Wembley. Elizabeth on a horse for the first time, she and Honey equally nervous. 3 days on, Jarvis Creek at Jarvis Forks. Swollen with rain, the river was such a raging torrent, we had to wait a whole day until it went down and could be forded. Vince, the party's cook, and Elizabeth splitting logs for the campfire. No chainsaws in those days. Fording on Jarvis Creek. It was a skillful business getting 75 horses safely across. Often the pack horses or the foals, we had 4 foals with us, got carried downstream and had to be rescued. We forded several times a day, the stronger horses leading the weaker ones. The water was usually up to the saddle, and for a whole week we were never dry. The scenery on the Jarvis was magnificent: glaciers, waterfalls, and misty mountain tops. Before reaching Jarvis Lake, we had to negotiate a box canyon. You have to climb to get into a box canyon and climb again to get out. It's most important to pack horses correctly. Their load must not slip during the river fordings. Janet helps Ray and is shown how to do the tricky diamond hitch. One of the foals. Finishing the diamond hitch. Adam off to cut trail. Spectacular glaciers on the Jarvis. We may have been the first Europeans ever to see them. After 8 days traveling up Jarvis Creek, Jarvis Lake at last. The lake was 8,000 feet up on the Continental Divide and surrounded by mountains. Unfortunately, a wrong camera setting obliterates its beautiful emerald color. From here, the guides knew their way. Having left dense forest behind, we were now in the foothills near the Alberta border. In open meadowland, it was easier to photograph the horses. This is Narcissus, Jumbo, Mary, Janet, two of the wranglers, Spike, and always bringing up the rear, Butch. The film ran out before the end of this rainbow. The pot of gold not shown. We had been 10 days without meat until Slug shot a moose between the eyes at 200 yards. Adam is the butcher. We had the liver for supper. A side trip to see Porcupine Falls. Possibly very few in the world have seen them. The only way down was by rope. Slug on the laborious upward climb. This is Bert Osborne, the outfitter, happy to have got the worst of the journey behind him. He had had great difficulty in collecting 86 horses to do the trip. Some horses were as old as 30 years. Some were unbroken Indian ponies. Hanging on to the horses' tails, the easy way up a steep climb. A bit of fun on Dandy. Once a circus horse, he'd been trained to rear when pulled in sharply. Pete Campbell, he had a great sense of humor. Bert Dalgleish, one of the ranchers who had brought his riding horses. Vince, our father figure, preparing for home and civilization again. He was the one who always made sure we were safely coping with the hazards of the trip. A typical supper around the campfire. Vince was a wizard at putting on a meal for 23 of us, often in pouring rain and when we were all dead tired. He baked bannock every day in a little oven over the fire. After supper, the wranglers talked horses into the early hours, and most evenings ended with a game of poker and the singing of sad cowboy songs. An Indian family, part of a band we met living in the wild with their horses. They lived in teepees and spoke no English. They put on a Mushigan or tea dance for us around their fire in the evening, and I got the tom-tom, trading it for my jacket. Unsaddling at the end of the day. Butch on the major, an old horse who was always at the tail end. It usually took between 2.5 and 3 hours for the first and last horses to make camp. Home and dry at Osborne's ranch at Wembley. Here we are, Jumbo, Butch, Slug, Janet, Charlotte, Elizabeth, Spike, and Mary. Young Osborne and his father put on a rodeo show for our entertainment. Mrs. Osborne outside the Osborne log cabin ranch house. the hotel in Wembley in those days. The local livery, which hired out horses and rigs. In 1937, there were no made-up roads in the Peace River block. Everyone rode horses. The river trip. Kay Howitt, Kitsy Nealon's, the 4 river guides, Rick, Kenny, Jim, and Walter. We traveled the route of Sir Alexander Mackenzie, the young Scot who became the first European to reach the Pacific overland north of Mexico. Here is his portrait. Simon Fraser, traveling from the Pacific up the river since called after him to what is now Prince George, followed the Pack River to McLeod Lake, where the first British settlement inland was established. Kay, Kitsy, and I traveled by train to Dawson Creek, at that time the end of steel in Alberta. From there we went by road to Fort St. John on the Peace River to join Nicholas, the boats and the guides for the homeward journey up the Peace to Findlay Forks and south up the Parsnip and Pack Rivers to Prince George. We were following exactly the route taken by Sir Alexander Mackenzie in 1793. We traveled on the back of this truck with the drums of gasoline needed to fuel the boats back to Prince George. The road, 80 miles long, was built on muskeg, and several times we got stuck in the sticky gumbo. The only people we saw en route were would-be ranchers clearing the land. Dawson Creek, then, was the jumping-off point for the north and had only been in existence for 6 years. We met the boys on the road, returning from Fort St. John to Edmonton and home. First view of the mighty Peace River, a dramatic sight against a background of golden fields of grain on the opposite bank. Traveling up the Peace towards the mountains, we came to the Hudson Bay post at Hudson's Hope. The inn and store. The post was at the beginning of a long portage that we and the boats were carried over, thus avoiding the very dangerous rapids that had smashed Alexander Mackenzie's boats to pieces. Getting the boats up rapids like these was a combined effort. An old man panning gold. From time to time on the river, we met a trapper or men panning gold. Several brown bears were spotted on the shore. A fun day of rest and fishing, where the narrow, wicked river joined the Peace, and the Peace churned its way through the mountains in a dramatic gorge with 300-foot sides overlooked by Mount Selwyn. It was Nicholas's favorite spot in the world. Kenny fishing at the junction of the Peace and the Wicked. An Arctic trout, one of several we had for supper. Sadly, Kenny was drowned a few months later. Trapper, who had lines both sides of the Wicked, made this contraption to get across. Kay and Walter try it out. There were many stretches of rapids like these before and after Findlay Forks. Nicholas in the bow. Many idle hours were spent like this in the calmer waters of the Parsnip. Traveling in the easy stretches. The little Indian church at Fort McLeod. The packed river approaching Prince George was very shallow. We had to pole and get out to pull, and it was called frogging riffles. The end of our trip. It had taken a week. 52 years on, the landscape has been greatly changed. Dawson Creek, Fort St. John, and Prince George are now sizable towns and important junctions for travelers traveling north. The Peace, west of Hudson's Hope, most of the Findlay River, and the Parsnip have all been flooded and are now Williston Lake. I hope the pictures on this film, taken before these modern developments, will be of interest to those interested in the past days of this glorious area. By good fortune, the film has remained sufficiently robust to put onto video. Putting the video together with maps and still photos has been fun. Speaking the commentary in the quietness of the hours between 2 and 5 a.m. was more difficult than anticipated. But here it is, with all its shortcomings, sent to you with love and best wishes. I am dedicating it to the memory of Nicholas Ignatieff, without whose initiative and love of the Peace River country, these exciting trips would never have taken place.